Thanks so much, Allison. We are really pleased to present this panel led by Dr. Steve Ostoja. Steve, thank you for co-chairing the Science Advisory Task Force of the Science Advisory Panel. Yes, the Science Advisory Panel of the task force over the last couple of years. We are doing so much collectively, and we want it to be grounded in science. And so your leadership and the time you're spending actually ensuring that these decisions are science-based is so critical. And you're also facilitating a conversation across the state among scientists and experts. So I think this panel is all about educating all of us on the conditions in the Central Coast and how we should consider those conditions. So welcome. Oh, you press a little red button.
Thank you. I need help with the simple things. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. We're really pleased to be here. As Secretary Crowfoot mentioned, I'm the co-chair of the Science Advisory Panel for the task force, and I do that with Dr. John Battles from University of California at Berkeley. I'm really pleased to be here today. So we can go ahead and transition to the slides. Yep, continue. Can we just go to the next slide? There we go. So this is, the title of our session is The Mosaic of the Central California. And as you can see from the images on the screen, they're varied, they're diverse, and they're also under threat by the combined effects of climate change and wildfire. These range from the Sargent Cypress Forest in San Luis Obispo County, where I actually went to undergrad at Cal Poly. Up north, the Salinas Valley, one of the richest and most productive agricultural regions in the state of California. Above that, you could see the valued rangelands and oak woodland ecosystems that overlook those pristine valleys. A little further north, here in your backyard, the coast redwoods, some of the tallest species on Earth, live all about us, dependent on fog drip, which again is under the threat of climate change. And just north of that, in the San Francisco Bay, this is a great image because it really illustrates what's at risk, right? So much of the Central Coast has this kind of what we call wildland urban interspace dynamic going on, where we're living in the ecosystems. A part of that. That's why we love this place. It's truly, truly beautiful. Like I've told people many times before, Cal Poly was the best 7 years of my life. It was truly 11. I did get 2 degrees there, but it was a long time. And it wasn't my fault Big Sur was so close. It's really one of the most beautiful places truly on Earth, and we're really pleased to be here. Next slide, please. But this region is no stranger to fire. The image that you can see on the screen is the time since last year in the Central Coast region. And it doesn't take a forest ecologist or a modeler to discern a pattern in a map like that. The very, very dark green are areas that haven't burned in 113 years. But what's notable about this slide is the big blobs, if you will, what we scientists call polygons, that are in deep red, have all burned recently. And what you note that as you shade the colors lighter yellow, orange to light green, those are more distant fires and they were much smaller. So the pattern is we're seeing a lot of big fires, and a lot of those big fires have just occurred. Next slide, please. And you all know all too well the devastation that these fires bring to the economies that are dependent on tourism, recreation, and a whole suite of other impacts they bring. This is an image from Swanton Pacific Ranch. This is where I did some of my undergrad training as a Cal Poly undergraduate student. And it was hard for me to see. And it's hard for me to look at, quite honestly. And a lot of you have that same emotional tie to this. And for me, I'm often asked, well, why do you do this task force thing? It seems really time consuming. And because look at you. You all look around, you're on the same team. This is our chance, and this is not happening anywhere else, not only in this country, but on Earth. I talk to delegations from all over the globe who come and try to ask, what are you doing? Look at this. And I can describe it succinctly, but we have the resources, we have a shared alliance between federal leadership and state leadership, the resources to match. We're working at the state level to give you what you need to do the work that you're telling us you need to do. So it's really a remarkable time. Next slide, please. So I'm going to set this panel up here. As Secretary Corbett said, and Director Wright said, we're putting together a lot of resources for you, tools, if you will, things that help you do your job more efficiently, more effectively, with ease. One of those products is this regional profile. This was the chief author of this was Chelsea Andrazi. She's not here today. She's a postdoc in our group. She's done a fantastic job. You can scan that QR code and it'll take you right to it. That's a science-based resource that characterizes the socio-ecological context of this region, but it also has incorporated stakeholder and expert opinion about what you see as the biggest risks, the values, the challenges, and the opportunities. That's all in this document. And this panel, we can go to the next slide now, and you'll have another opportunity to scan that code, as well as the regional resource kit that Dr. Peter Stein will talk about, and Director Richard Barheit talked about earlier in the day. So again, this is the Central Coast Mosaic. Just in the interest of time, because we are a little bit over, and I think I'd, for one, rather hear my voice, but hear the panelists' expertise. I'm going to kind of skim over their bios, if that's okay with you. We have 3 local within the region experts. We're gonna start off with Dr. Virginia Matzik from Santa Clara University. She's going to talk about the ecosystems across the region, why they're important, and what are some of the risks, stressors, and associated concerns around those. We're going to then go to Professor Chris Dykes at my alma mater, Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. He's going to be talking about the wildland-urban interface, protecting it, and what could be done to safeguard the communities in and around the Central Coast. And finally, Dr. Peter Nelson from UC Berkeley will talk about cultural burning and indigenous land use practices and how to better engage those tribal communities and indigenous peoples into the conversation and facilitate what they need to do to be stewards of their land. So without further ado, it's a fun word to say, Virginia.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. You can advance slides. Don't move the mouse, just click.
I have my orders. Okay, let's see if this works. Nope. No, Forrest, I don't think so. Okay, if I could have the next one, please. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk about my favorite place on Earth. And this slide encapsulates a lot of why it's my favorite place on Earth, because this is a color map of the vegetation of the Central Coast region. And what I want you to appreciate here is what a rainbow this is. I mean, this is the other color maps of other places in California. They don't look like this. They don't have this diversity. They don't have this interspersion of, pixel to pixel, acre to acre of change in ecosystem types with so much diversity. We have everything. We have from the densely urbanized, Bay Area to rural agriculture, lots of preserved wilderness. We have that cool coastal maritime influence that's so different from the inland valleys that are much drier. We have wetlands in the north. We have deserts in the south. And all of these ecosystems are characterized by different historical fire regimes. And so we need to be thinking as we manage for this, that managing for the mosaic is a complex task that needs to be really needs to drill down into what each of these ecosystem components are like. Next slide, please. And I'm going to argue, I'm just going to brag. This is the best of California. This is a place where you come for California. This is essential California. These iconic landscapes. If you could give me a few more clicks to pull out the oak woodlands, the coastal prairies, the redwood forests, and the chaparral and shrublands. These are unique to California. Everybody's talking about the super blooms right now. Everybody, associates redwoods with California. The oak woodland is the place where I grew up and where I feel most at home. These are our California Mediterranean ecosystems, and they're really shaped by the unique weather patterns in the Central Coast region and the unique topography. So we have fog drip that is, helping these ancient redwoods. Normally, trees as tall as redwoods would not be able to live in the heat and drought of California, but the fact that summer fog persists and the trees are adapted to trap the fog droplets and drip them down onto their own soil is why we have these ancient redwoods persisting in this area. And same thing with fire-dependent ecosystems in the maritime chaparral and the scrublands and our coastal prairies. They're all here because of the topography, the intermix of slope and aspect, the unique weather patterns, and historical legacies of indigenous management. And so it's just it's so California. I kind of can't get over it. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through a few of these ecosystems just to highlight some of the important features of their biodiversity, their ecosystem services, particularly carbon sequestration and/or fire regime, just so you can kind of get a little familiarity. Probably most of you are familiar with them already anyway. Oak woodlands, hugely important economically, culturally, ecologically, from a biodiversity standpoint. Many, many species wholly dependent on them. We have almost all of the coast live oak woodland in our region. We also have significant blue oak woodland. We have other oak species like valley oak. And the open kind of park-like woodlands that we see and we hope to continue seeing are essentially a legacy of millennia of indigenous stewardship, using cultural burns to preserve acorns as a food resource and basket materials and provide for wildlife food and so on. So we have something here to preserve that has a historical context to it that we need to appreciate. Next slide, please. The redwoods, obviously iconic. They're not a huge part of our land area, but they really have an outsized impact, partly due to their iconic status and partly because they are such a big carbon stock. Most of our redwood forest is second growth, right? Very little old growth left, so it has been logged over. And generally these trees are very resistant to fire, both low intensity and high intensity fire. But we're now seeing, with the extreme and unusual catastrophic fire behavior that is exacerbated by droughts, climate change, and so on, that that might be starting to rival logging as a threat to the redwoods. Next slide, please. I want to highlight the mixed evergreen forests, which if you look at the regional profile, they're called hardwood conifer forests, which might actually be a better name because what's really unique about these is that they are a mix of hardwood and conifer species. So you might get Doug firs, pines, along with maples or tan oaks or madrones. And the combination of those two makes for a wider variety of food resources for animal species. So it's a really important ecosystem type. Notably, some of the trees in these associations require very intense fire to regenerate. So again, we have to pay attention to the specific fire regime. Next slide. Shrublands don't get as much love as they ought to, but the coastal sage scrub, just kind of like some people call it soft chaparral, the soft-leaved woody species, and then the harder chaparral, the maritime chaparral, that is very respondent to intense fire to germinate. Really important on our coast. Shrublands are 22% of that veg map. Next slide. And then the grasslands and prairies. So here I'm showing you a coastal prairie photo. The spectacular, what they have in common, the coastal prairie and the inland grasslands, are the displays of wildflowers in the spring. Some people say we should call them forblands and not grasslands. They just represent this, biodiversity hotspot that is, again, very iconically Californian. And they're kind of underappreciated, at least where the grasses are perennial, as a carbon sink, because a lot of that biomass is actually in the root material that's held below ground, and so it's more fireproof in some ways than above ground biomass that we see in the forests and woodlands. This coastal prairie right here, beautiful as it is, it requires constant disturbance to maintain it like that. So it would have been historically cultural burning and ungulate grazing, like from tule elk, and now we're trying to figure out how to restore those processes so that woody shrubs and trees don't invade. Next, please. So thinking about the threats to these systems, obviously climate change underpins everything that we see in change in the state. I'm particularly concerned, if you give me a click, next slide, about the possible disappearance in the future of the fog, because these coastal ecosystems are so uniquely dependent on the maritime weather, the cooler, wetter, foggier patterns. And then next slide, we also have drought exacerbating these overstocked inland woodlands and forests. Of course, this is partly the legacy of fuel suppression or fire suppression that you heard about earlier, but drought is exacerbating it. So that's our climate change effect. Next slide. Second would be invasion and encroachment. So I'm distinguishing here the two because invasion, I'm thinking about non-native species invading where they don't belong, as opposed to encroachment being native woody species encroaching on non-woody ecosystems like the prairie. So even though they're native, they're still kind of out of place. That's almost entirely the product of the loss of cultural burns. We're really seeing that, woody encroachment, conifer encroachment on oak woodland, maybe more in the north coast and then the central coast, but shrubs encroaching on coastal prairie for sure. Next slide. And then we have non-native species like eucalyptus and acacia that are, if you look at the stripped bark on that eucalyptus, you can see how much that tree wants to burn. And it's adding flammability to places where we wouldn't have had that kind of fire intensity in the past. But this is super controversial, right? Because some people think that ukes are just as iconic a part of the California landscape as the redwood. And they might be harboring migrating monarch butterflies at particular times of the year. So all of these things have been brought out in the regional profiles from your stakeholder input. Thank you for that. And then finally, disease and pests, again, irrevocably, inextricably tied up with climate change and with invasion, these novel pests and pathogens that have come in and that are leaving our forests with a whole bunch of extra standing fuel that we don't want. And we're also concerned for oak woodlands about the pest that's currently in Southern California, the gold-spotted oak borer, and whether, if it's just a matter of time, that crosses up into the Central Coast region and starts decimating our oak woodland resource the way it has down there. So next slide. Thinking about how we manage this, Secretary Crowfoot, you said that part of the reason for the regional approach here is to not have a one-size-fits-all solution coming down from Sacramento. But even within the Central Coast, a one-size-fits-all prescription is not going to work, like not one fuel treatment, not one prescribed burn. So thinking about some of the innovative things I've been seeing in this region, I'll just highlight a few. Conservation grazing, for instance, in coastal prairie, where if you don't have your tule elk anymore, maybe a cow will do. And the trick is to figure out, what's the stocking rate, how many cattle, and what time during the year do you have them there to eat the annual grasses and preserve the forbs. Climate smart restoration. So I'm hearing about all these seedlings that we need to have for replanting, and absolutely we do, but are we thinking about the genotypes? Are we thinking about bringing genotypes from further south or from lower elevation up when we are planning for a resilient ecosystem for the future? Fuel thinning, treatments, prescribed burn, more cultural burn. I want to highlight that we also have to figure out, kind of the question is, how much biomass do we want and what kind and where? How much disturbance do we want and what kind and where? And so innovating in terms of disturbance like conservation grazing and prescribed burn, but also innovating in like, what do we do with this excess biomass? What kind of wood utilization are we going to do? And I've been, I was at SoCal a couple of weeks ago and was hearing about the Elkhorn Slough charcoal kiln that they have now to convert a bunch of this invasive eucalyptus biomass that they don't want into, that would otherwise go up in smoke and be an emission into a stable carbon source. So that's exciting stuff, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Virginia. We'll transition slides, and we will now hear from Dr. Chris Dykes from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo around the wildland-urban interface and community protection.
Well, first what I want to do is just recognize that there is a tension here, and this is a very different look than a lot that what you're involved with. It struck me when Mr. Lopez talked about fire being a gift. It is, and it's a critical ecosystem process all across the world, all across the Central Coast. But you look at the photo behind me here, it's like, this is where the tension comes up. This is like, it looks like a battlefield. And it's because it is a battlefield when you start looking at more at the assets that we're trying to protect. And so my comments are going to be based upon, frankly, it's trauma that's been in my career. I've been at the worst fires in the US. I've dug through the rubble sites at Black Saturday in Australia where entire families died. I've seen people suffering all around. It's sad that you actually, it disturbs me that you actually get a little bit numb to the destruction. But one thing that I have never gotten over is human suffering. And so if I can get up in the morning and do something that's going to alleviate human suffering, and some of the comments are going to be based upon this, this is what I want to talk about because it drives me. It drives me in my career. So on the Central Coast in the wildland-urban interface, it's fascinating working across the world is that we see a lot of very similarity things, whether you're in Chile, South Africa, Australia, on the Central Coast. But there's certainly some certain nuances that kind of the Central Coast varies over other places. One of the things I see as issues is that, the housing density. Along, most of the people that we see on the Central Coast are kind of based in the more the coastal regions. And so we see places like up at the East Bay where kind of this interface era that we're in was kind of ushered in 1991 at the Oakland Hills fires. And so you find that the housing density a lot of places along the coast tends to be very, very, very close together, which in the name of housing costs, we do this, but that serves to have house to house to house ignition. Very quickly, as we come out, there away from there, more to the east, we certainly find that things become much more intermix, which is a very different way of kind of approaching the problem. We see less of that perhaps in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but we find that very quickly as we go inland, away from the coastal fog, which I live in the coastal fog, it's awesome. But you see these amazing microclimates, which makes it very interesting to go. And I know like in the Big Sur and other places, I've noticed like literally less than a mile distance-wise, you could be camping in the Big Sur near the coast. It can be 55 degrees and drizzling on you, and literally less than a mile away distance-wise, it could be 100 degrees. And so you're dealing with this issue going on. And so the farther you go east, it certainly gets drier, and this kind of changes up the vegetation types you see. So there's different ways to look at that. Now within this, the microclimates also, there's microclimates in culture. You certainly see farther, in the eastern portions as you get over the Santa Lucia Mountains on the Central Coast, it becomes more rural, more ranching, sort of a mindset. On the coast, it tends to be, it's more of it's not really urbanized, I guess, until you get into the Bay Area, but it's a different attitude, and so it's a different thought. And with that attitude, I found that this is not dissimilar, but I've certainly see it, especially along the coastal area where most of the people are. It's like, this will never happen to me. I live in the fog, right? And for most of us, it's not a problem until it's a problem. And so you see, like we talked about Swanton Pacific Ranch with like you. It was trauma for me because I spent so much time. On my interview back in 2001, I'm going out into the forest and it's like, you won't have much use here, because this is the asbestos forest. I'm looking around, it's like every fifth tree has a fire scar on it, and I'm trying to get a job. It's like, interesting, sort of thing. So, kind of carrying this on, it's like, well, we won't have this. And then in 2009, we had the Lockheed fire. It's like, we've got this saved. Well, we're done. We don't have to worry about this. And I kind of came up with some of the folks, and it's like, look, I know I've got my lens, I've got my focus, but I'm kind of concerned, about this. And it's like, no, I think we got it. And then, of course, we see the CZU came through and burned everything down, which again is just like, And I see this in my own neighborhood. It won't happen to me. And for most of the places that we see along the coast and the fog zone, fire, honestly, it's not a problem until it is a problem. And I can say that fire is going to be a problem, especially, with the changes in demographics and the changes in the climate that we see. So we have to get over, the idea it's not going to happen to us. And another thing that's kind of unique, I won't say it's unique, but it's especially accentuated on the California Central Coast, is an attitude. It's like, we love to fight. you know? And so you see a lot of good projects actually get tied up a lot of times in the regulatory process because we get so tunnel visioned into our values that we've got that we recognize that there's many things that are going on. And so as we get tied up into these fights, we have problems with, the costs that come along. Now, other things that we certainly see on the Central Coast is our road network. It's not the greatest. We've got a lot of very narrow, windy roads. My Wildland Urban Interface class just looked at a community that the single entrance way into this community was 12 miles. You had 12 miles and it's one way out of this. And so it's not good. And so especially as you go inland, you also find it's not just people trying to get out, but sometimes people would, leave their children behind to get their horses out, right? It's very important to them, the livestock, the horses, things. It's not only just livelihood, it's part of who they are. And so you can imagine on this very not good road network, you've got panic ensuing, smoke you can't see. You've got firefighters trying to get in, people trying to get out with their livestock. This is a real issue. So one of the things that I would propose and suggest is that, do we want to get people out? Do we want to get the things the things are important? Absolutely, that's our first choice. But that cannot be our only choice. There has to be alternatives, whether that be a safe refuge area that's purposely designated. I've seen buildings designated like community centers, parks, these other things that we can set up. It's like, we want you to get out, but if you can't, then we're going to go here. And we've seen that works. We move on. Other things, we talk about equity. That's a big word, and that's used a lot today. And one of the issues that I've seen here, is like, again, mentioned this earlier, that the housing cost. And we find that more and more, I literally, where I'm at, I could probably high five my neighbor out my kitchen window because the lot sizes are small because everything is so expensive. And so we look at this photo, you see that there's all this destruction during the CZU. Forest looks okay, right? But it's that house to house to house thing, and that's an issue. And also along with the housing, we've got a workforce that we have to put in, to do the good things we're trying. And I'm a professional, and I struggle, to try to get in. And so, how are we going to house the people to do the good work? Other issues with this is insurance. Insurance, if you can get it, is very, very, very expensive. At present, there's very little incentive to actually do good work to bring down your premiums coming on. And we find that more and more people are underinsured. And so I've been to places where people, it's like there's 5 years after a fire, they're still living in a fifth wheel on their property because they didn't have enough money from their insurance to rebuild. And finally, the other thing is coming through is like these retrofits. We know that it costs money to do these things. A lot of us, we got T-ball, we don't think about this, but this is incredibly important with our retrofits. But if you build it from the beginning with Chapter 7A codes, yes, there is added cost, and we know that Chapter 7A works. We've seen it. But to retrofit these existing properties where we've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of housing units, this is an issue. How do you pay for it? How do you incentivize people to say, hey, this is important? So this is an issue. So we'll move on to our final thing where we'll talk about just some sort of general solutions out there. Is that we mentioned that this is, as my way I look at it, it's like a battlefield. And again, there is that tension. I recognize that because I love doing prescribed fires. I love doing this thing. But if we look at this as a battlefield, we have to shape the battlefield. If you look at firefighters' analogy as soldiers coming in, we have got to sit there and prepare that battlefield so that they're going to be most successful. And recognize that more than likely, they're not showing up. So how can you make this more resistant? Another thing is like, we have to break our academic silos. In my career, I've seen it over and over and over. It's not just a U.S. Central Coast thing. You get a group of folks together, firefighters talk with firefighters about firefighting. Scientists talk with other scientists about research sorts of things. And you have to break down these things and get us all. And then again, we also have to work at multiple scales. My people, the ecologists, the foresters, we tend to look at things, like fuel treatments out in the wildlands, prescribed fires, different fuel breaks. Awesome. I want this. I want all of it. But we have to remember, I look at this as not as a forest fire problem, a shrub fire problem. This is a houses burning down problem. So we have to, in my opinion, start at the house, then move out to like the landscaping, and then move out, to the things that are outside. So it's just sort of a different look at things. And just an example of some things that I'm involved with, and there's a whole host of it that you can talk about. We have a new Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute at Cal Poly, where we have people that are disciplinary from fire protection engineering to city and regional planning to biology and ecology that's out there. And I was on a phone call this morning with architects, a city regional planner, a geographer, and myself looking at wildland urban interface issues. And so this is a good thing. Our Fire Safe Council in San Luis Obispo, I think, is exemplary. Some of you know Dan Turner, who is the executive director there. He's a former unit chief that's there. He purposely, back 20 years ago, got people from these different disciplines that sometimes would be at tension, purposely engaging ranchers, purposely engaging folks from the environmental community, getting people from Air Resources Board, EPA, others in there to kind of work together. And so that's been exemplary, getting work done on the ground. And finally, we also, at Cal Poly, we have a new fuels management training program where we're doing things all across the state to try to develop our workforce and looking at a whole lot of things to do this all across the state, because we got good things to do, but we don't have the people to do it. And we're trying to equip them to do the good work to stop this cycle of repetitive loss.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I think, one of the high points of that was that breaking down these silos and looking across a group of people you don't normally interact with. One of the reasons I call them Chris, Virginia, Peter is for that, right? To eliminate that. So when you get a break, we're going to transition to Peter Nelson, which I'm actually really looking forward to, and then we're going to have some time for questions and some input from y'all if we have time, is to make a connection. I think that's super important. That's why we're here. So with that, I want to transition to Peter Nelson. He's a professor in environmental policy. Oh gosh, I'm going to screw this up. It's EPSM. So I messed it up. I apologize. These acronyms kill me. And it's even harder when you have a little bit of dyslexia, right? He's from UC Berkeley, and he's going to be talking about cultural burning and other topics related to that. So, Peter.
All right, thank you. It's actually Environmental Science Policy and Management, and I'm also in the Ethnic Studies and Native Studies department as well. Opumi Kontoish. Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Nelson. I'm Coast Miwok and enrolled in the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. It's great to be here, and I wanted to thank Chairman Val Lopez for the land acknowledgement and for being here today as well. So next slide. I'll get right into my presentation here about cultural burning, and starting with talking about the people of this region in the Central Coast region. The boundaries, as we put boundaries on things, don't necessarily always make sense. Even the ethno-linguistic boundaries, as Chairman Lopez mentioned in his talk as well, there are several different tribes in each one of these areas. And so we can talk about ethno-linguistically, there are Coast Miwok, Ohlone, Bay Miwok, Esalen, Salinan, Yokuts, and Chumash peoples in and around this central area. But that's not to mention, that there are all of these other tribes within all these areas as well. So next slide. One of the things that I'd like to bring up is work that's been done by Lee Panich and others talking about the impacts of anthropological research and policy decisions by the BIA and officials on determining federal recognition in California, and the perception that tribes along the coast have been more impacted than tribes outside of the limits of Spanish missionization. And so I've written about this in an article, Where Have All the Anthros Gone, as well. I'm not going to go too much into this, but just to bring out the point that we're dealing with a political landscape that's very different than some of the other regions of California, with two federally recognized tribes, the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, as well as Santa Ynez Chumash at the very southern end of the coast, and many non-recognized tribes in between here. And so that offers different challenges, different opportunities. Some of the constraints may be that non-recognized tribes rely more on volunteers for staffing. Federally recognized tribes may have more economic development, more of a land base, but there are complexities here as well with some non-recognized tribal entities or quasi-recognized entities that do have allotment land. So it's a very complex landscape, and just to acknowledge that all of these tribes need to be consulted with in their unique capacities and as tribal nations separately. So let's go to the next slide. Looking at this region, cultural burning has been a part of this area for a very long time. There were more people, higher population densities in California than any other place in North America north of Mexico. And this has to do with the unique type of land stewardship that was being implemented in California to make the resources more biodiverse and abundant. And so you can see an example here also from Pinnacles National Park, the work of, the collaborative work of the Amamutsun Tribal Band and agencies, as well as, an image here of this diverse patchwork of an intellectual model of what cultural burning would look like, implemented through a series of years, different resource patches being cared for. Next slide. So cultural burning is done for many different reasons: fuels reduction, for trail maintenance, safety, promoting the health and abundance of foods, habitat for animals as well as plants, all sorts of different things. And there is some overlap with prescribed burning. I would like to acknowledge that, but they're done for very different purposes, and as others, again, have mentioned, that there are other components to traditional ecological knowledge within the larger traditional knowledge of tribes that get into religious prayers and ceremonies and other aspects that may not necessarily translate into Western science. But those aspects are very important for the context of cultural burning, why we do it, and how it's implemented. And so cultural burning is a matter of tribal sovereignty. Only Native American people can do this kind of burning. And when we're talking about doing cultural burning, Native people need to be involved. And there are other options as well in terms of tribally informed prescribed burning and other iterations of that as well, when there can't be a full cultural burn, but something to consider. So next slide. Within the Central Coast region, we have very low instances of lightning strikes and lots of accumulations of fuels in the absence of management, which is why we have these wildfires. So to ensure the sustainability and security of a lot of these places, as well as the abundance of food and cultural materials, there has to be some sort of cultural burning or land stewardship going on. So next slide. In the past, as well as what we would like to see today and on into the future, is cultural burning that maintains grasslands and coastal prairies in this Central Coast region. We see this in the past in archaeobotanical samples, this maintenance of these open landscapes that would otherwise convert back to dense conifer forests. And so for thousands of years, these areas have been tended by fire and by cultural practitioners. Next slide. So when these areas aren't tended, resources in the Central Coast like gray willow and hazel that are needed for basketry get riddled with bugs or grow in ways that are not conducive to really strong shoots that are needed for these baskets that are used for cooking and need to be watertight. So fire resets that and cleans out those bugs from these resource patches so that they can be used for these purposes. Next slide. So we have a lot of colonial policies, fire suppression that's been ongoing for a very long time with ad campaigns, wilderness that separate people from nature. And this has contributed to the fuels that we see, as well as the denial of access for Native people in a lot of these open spaces and areas within our territory. And again, the different situations with different tribal areas, some areas have U.S. Forest Service lands and BLM lands, others do not. So there are different opportunities in terms of hunting and things like that as well, where there may not be those opportunities in other people's tribal territories. Next slide. So another instance of these colonial policies, tan oak and bay laurel, they've been cut down for hide tanning in the instance of tan oak, and not preferable for timber, and so poisoned or cut down to make more space for conifers. And now being removed because they're standing dead, impacted by sudden oak death, and in the case of bay laurel being a carrier of that disease, when in fact these are the staple foods and medicines for a lot of people along the Central Coast, and really significant cultural plants. So coming up with other solutions, considering these policies in collaboration with tribes here on the coast is very important in thinking about our futures and the cumulative impacts that we have on our future generations. Next slide. So this just shows, when we're considering integrating traditional ecological knowledge into our management plans, we need to be careful not to extract or appropriate this knowledge, and definitely work with tribal people and tribes to ensure that there's no appropriation going on. So tribal leadership in fire, and a lot of these practices, working with and collaborating and consulting, all of these activities, so that it's not like a resource extraction like gold or oil or lithium or these other industries that have had impacts on our tribal lands and resources. Next slide. So some exemplary collaborations that we have here in the Central Coast. We've talked about the Amamutsun tribal band, and we've heard directly from Chairman Lopez, but I just wanted to reiterate again that they're a really good example of a non-recognized tribe that's done really great relationship building with agencies and organizations to create training opportunities and opportunities for themselves to have land stewards and steward their tribal lands. Other examples are my tribe, Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria, that's developed co-management agreements with Sonoma County Regional Parks, MOUs with the national parks, and donations to other organizations like Audubon Canyon Ranch that I work with as well, doing prescribed and cultural burning in our tribal territory. And I'm happy to say that I've written the first prescribed burn plan that a Coast Miwok person has ever written that will be implemented this fire season in our territory at Tom's Point along Tomales Bay. So these are major wins for us. Yeah, thank you. So I'll get to the final slide, which is recommendations. So just again, reiterating some of the points, needing to engage on all levels with tribes at the community level, community-based operations with our different tribal communities, as well as working directly with culture bearers and individuals. The different needs in the Central Coast region is really capacity building, because we do have some great examples, but we need lots more. And so here in this region, we really need training, we need certification opportunities, financial and institutional support to make those things happen. And again, reiterating the land access and permitting so that we can go out and practice our traditional knowledge in terms of how we take care of these different areas as well, that we may not have access to right now. And then in supporting tribal sovereignty, maybe more meetings exclusively for tribes to talk about in each of these regions, how to further assess these needs, because I can't speak to all of those needs or speak for tribes. It's really up to tribes in that consultation process, and collaborations to really draw those out as well. And then, I really appreciate all of the work of the task force and being a part of this today, and I look forward to how I can support in the future. Thank you.
I think we have a couple minutes, and we're going to go to a poll in just a moment. I'll tell you about how that works when we get there. But I just want to kick it off with you, Peter, and following up on something you said that really struck me. And you had one of the main headers in your last slide, meeting tribal needs around capacity building, training, certification. Could you put maybe a finer point on that for us quickly?
Yeah. So there are a lot of training opportunities available. A lot of these come from the prescribed burn associations, the PBAs, and they're fantastic training opportunities. But one of the things that I think is a need in many of these areas is really tribally led training opportunities as well. Whether that be exclusively tribal or tribally led with a lot of assistance from, say, some of these PBAs. And so the reason for that is that cultural burning will look different than prescribed burning, and learning directly from our culture bearers in how to put fire on the ground in that way is a really important aspect of seeing how the these operations could be done differently. So the different burns that I really do appreciate, in my area done by ACR look very different than, say, going to work with Ron Good in the Sierras and learning from him, which I've done as well. And so, getting that perspective from both sides and trying to do the best that we can to integrate that knowledge and move that around to all of these different areas, I think is going to be really essential. So facilitating those kinds of opportunities to create more networks and interconnectedness between our tribal people and create those opportunities. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And as Secretary Crowfoot's mentioned several times, we're here today to hear from you. I mean, that's reflected in that regional profile, and it's going to be in this first question, which you're already voting on. I guess I don't need to provide directions. And off the charts is strategic, well, maybe not. Hold, please. I know I have my favorites. It's like watching a race, right? Well, just in the interest of time, let's go to, I think, strategic fuel breaks. It looks like invasive species was catching up. But maybe we'll direct this at Chris, since this is right up his wheelhouse. Maybe for the Central Coast region, we're hearing time and time again as we're going around the state, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Not everything works or is appropriately for every region. Every tool is not appropriate for every region. Can you tell us more specifically what the appropriate application of fuel breaks are or look like, and how well they achieve community protection versus any impacts, ecosystem degradation, what have you, on these diverse ecosystems in the region?
Well, certainly from experience, these strategic fuel breaks, putting dozer lines and whatnot out, it's not intended to stop the fire. I mean, these embers, which are getting through, it readily goes over, 2-3 miles. I've seen this on the Central Coast coming through. So, if the 101, which in some places can be 10 lanes, is not going to stop a wildfire, you're not going to see the doze thing. But what it does do is it provides safe access for the operations folks to get in there. So in my opinion, if we were to have a strategic fuel break, go in with that. And I would advocate also combining this with the road networks, being able to get in to make safe access, ingress and egress out there. Combine these things out so you do double duty, that it helps the operations folks and it also helps public safety during evacuations.
Thank you very much. I think we can quickly get in a question. Yeah, I got the yes. So we're going to go to poll now. Would Secretary Crowfoot, would you or?
Well, first of all, exceptional panel.
Yep.
I mean, this is becoming my favorite part of these regional meetings, is being educated both on the ecology, the community, the tribal. So you guys just hit it out of the park. Let's stay on communities for a moment. And, I want to ask you a candid question. Because I feel like while we're making great progress on a lot of the resilience work outside of communities, we have a lot of ground to cover inside communities. So, Chris, if you had a magic wand, talking to the people up here and people in the audience, what would you have us do to build more wildfire resilience within communities?
In my opinion, it's just sort of a change in mindset, a paradigm, which again, I come from an ecology background, land management, and that's what we tend to focus on. But again, if this is, I mentioned before, this is, you've got a wildfire, but the problem is our homes burning down, human suffering. So let's change the paradigm from starting on the outside and moving in and focus more from the house with fire protection engineers, architects, and others. Move out to landscape architecture, defensible space, and the things that we collect, and then come out. So it's kind of a paradigm shift because we focus and we think about forest fires, but we gotta focus on the things that are burning down.
And quick specific follow-up, when you think about that house-to-house ignition, home hardening, as we call it, seems really important. But in some communities, it doesn't seem like it's really caught on. Any suggestions around how to expand or amplify people modifying their houses, sometimes in very cheap ways to reduce ember-driven or house-to-house ignitions?
Well, on the Central Coast, it makes it interesting because, again, there's this attitude. It's like, well, what do I care? Fire's not an issue here, and until it is, right? And so there's all these other competing things that work. You've got, kids in T-ball, everything else. And it's like, it's not only just a money thing, but incentivizing people to say, yeah, this is an issue. And it takes time, it takes money. So it's a difficult sell, especially, with all the other things. I mean, we're so busy. I would love to find the magic wand, because I've tried to convince my neighbor, the guy I can high five. It's like, I've done everything I can, but his house goes down, I'm going down, and I know that.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a fantastic question, and it's well framed. And certainly there's an educational component around this, right? And knowing what we need to focus on in terms of increasing the literacies around reducing the impacts of devastating wildfires is certainly important. I did want to take a minute and ask Virginia a question, because there's a couple of interesting points that came up. Oak woodlands are obviously a cherished resource in the region. They're culturally important. They're also under the threat of climate change, right? We know that things are getting warmer. We're getting more extreme events, not just in terms of temperature, but as we've seen this year, precipitation. There are pathogens on the way. What can we do, or what can collaborators or groups that are engaged in management applications do or be thinking about now in light of future conditions to safeguard these resources? Does anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I honestly don't think that this is an information problem or a research problem. I mean, we had the integrated hardwood range management program going back to the 80s, where then the major threats we were thinking about was like oak woodland conversion to vineyards and ranchettes and so on, which is still going on. But now, we're thinking more in terms of drivers that are really difficult to stop, like how do we stop the climate change driver that is drying things out? So I think what comes to mind is thinking about fireproofing stands and being really selective about what the density is, how many straws on the landscape, right? How much moisture is being pulled out, and also thinking about how to integrate these systems that have not historically been exploited for timber into like forest health, right? I think we have not so far. I mean, that's I think a really fertile area for CAL FIRE and for CARB to be thinking about is. The early scoping was all around, for natural and working lands, tended to be around carbon in forests because we knew what yields were, it was easy to measure, and now we have like, well, what about these riparian forests? What about these oak woodlands that aren't counting, or people are just kind of at sea as to how to figure out how to fit them into the funding framework of CARB and forest health program for CAL FIRE. So.
Yeah. Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to just take a minute and invite anyone else from the executive committee before we transition to our last panel member. If you have any questions for this science panel today.
So thinking about the two last questions, one on the WUI and the other on the oak woodlands piece, I'd like to pose a question to Peter. Nelson in regards to, from a tribal perspective, thinking of the villages that have lived in these places for thousands of years and the ways that those landscapes were treated, and if you could offer some perspective on kind of that as the traditional WUI and the stewardship of those oak woodlands.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Don. So thinking about the oak woodlands as a WUI, yeah, you know, with the absence of fire, what we're seeing is the encroachment of all of these different brush materials in our oak woodlands and forests and other areas. And you see that a lot of cultural materials, whether that be food or medicine or tool materials, get pushed out of these areas into almost sort of food deserts of a sort. And so it really makes these places unlivable, and it pushes us out of having access to those areas. And so fire stewardship, land stewardship, is a way to provide us access. There's the physical access, you know, through the gate code to that land, but then once you have access on that land, can you move through that land? You know, so those things are very, very important in terms of maintaining places that are habitable and homes for us in the places where we've learned this knowledge about how to interact with those places and where we should be and what we should be doing and how we should be interacting with the world.
That's great. So we're gonna transition the panel to the final panelist. Dr. Peter Stein is with the Climate Wildfire Institute. He's had a 40-year career with the Forest Service as well as with U.S. Geological Survey. I consider Peter a friend, and he doesn't know this, but he's a mentor. He's really just a wonderful human being and very much dedicated to safeguarding these communities and ecosystems. As I mentioned, this panel was really designed and set up to showcase the region and unpack some of the vignettes, if you will, around some of the more pointed socio-ecological and social systems within the region. I think this panel did a great job. That profile sets that up, which you can download. We'll provide the QR for that in a bit. But as was mentioned earlier, there are regional resource kits, which you can really think of as toolboxes of all kinds of different things, including sets of metrics and data layers to help you make better decisions around the priorities and values that you all have in the sphere that you're working. And now Peter Stein is going to talk about those and an element of those here for the next few minutes. Peter?
Thanks, Steve. To be the speaker between you and your lunch. I'm going to try to be quick. This is just be a brief overview of what these regional resource kits are about. Hopefully we'll be able to explore these at your leisure later and dive deeper into it. Next slide. So we all know why this is happening, but I think we're seeing unprecedented levels of alignment across agencies. And this is why we have hope, because I think it will take a cross-boundary effort to make this all happen, particularly at the scale that it needs to happen, the landscape scale. Next. So I'm going to talk about the metrics specifically. That's our niche in this, but the regional resource kits are a combination of a lot of things. You've heard about the pillars of resilience, and I'll be speaking a little bit about that. Monitoring and evaluation, project inventory, assessments, and decision support, all part of what we consider broadly the regional resource kits. Our focus is on building the suite of our library of geospatial data, the metrics that will help inform all of this work. Next. So the 4 regions of California, you can see here, we've completed the kit for the Sierra and for Southern California. We've just loaded up and made live the Central Coast, and then we'll be moving to the North Coast next. These are curated management relevant, high-quality geospatial data that are developed by a team of scientists from these organizations, Forest Service, Climate and Wildfire Institute, CAL FIRE and FRAP, and University of California. Next. So the pillars of resilience basically are 10 themes or management outcomes that we strive for in land management. And the metrics are embedded underneath the pillars and elements. So the structure is, we're using this hierarchical structure to identify the relevant and feasible metrics that we can put together as geospatial data. Next. I want to emphasize that these data are not a substitute for field knowledge or local knowledge, but they are meant to be a complement to them. And they are wall-to-wall data for each region. So for the Central Coast, we currently have, actually it's now 61 data layers. In these are the 10 pillars here. So you can see that some pillars have a lot more data than others. We are striving to build these kits and to make sure that they're kept up to date, and that we will therefore add new information as we get it to add new data layers. We're also providing 15 what we call operational data layers, which are basically GIS data that are relevant to land management, such as road systems, ownership boundaries, et cetera. Next. So I'm going to give real quick examples of what these data layers are like. They're all pretty much 30-meter rasters, that is to say cells data. So they're high-resolution data, and they cover those 10 pillars. This example shows this is one of the data layers under the fire adapted communities pillar. This is source of ember load to buildings. So this particular data shows where embers are coming from that might reach buildings. So this one I think can be very useful in terms of focusing where treatments might be needed. A second example here is tree cover. This is in the forest and shrubland pillar. This shows the total cover per pixel that is provided by trees. The redwoods surely stand out here. Next slide. The biodiversity pillar has the most of all of our pillars, and this one is habitat connectivity, which shows places where there's limited connectivity opportunities. By the same token, it shows places where connectivity is extremely important or irreplaceable. So this can assist in helping maintain these corridors and being aware that they exist. Next. The carbon metric, this particular pillar shows where there is abundance of carbon, and once again, the places where redwoods exist stand out. Next. Whoops. The last example I have is the social and cultural well-being metric or pillar. This is poverty percentile. This is by the census tracts, and these show where there are a higher percentage of people 2 times below the federal poverty level. So this is a quick snapshot of a few of the metrics. There are, as I said, 61 now. Steve, you're going to show where people can get access to the website.
Yes, in a couple slides.
So my last slide is just a little touch on what these metric kits can be used for. They can be used to assess conditions, both current conditions and future conditions on landscape, identify where places are that might need treatment the most, plan those treatments across large landscapes, examine conditions of different metrics and the potential management challenges they present. An important possibility is using them to compare trade-offs, which there'll always be trade-offs between different management strategies. These data can be used to inform and develop NEPA and CEQA documents when there are already good examples of where this has been done. And then finally, monitoring changing conditions and progress towards goals. So we expect and have developed these kits to be able to serve this variety of applications. And I want to emphasize that this is fresh off the press. The first iteration of the Central Coast is now live. And this is what we would consider version 1.0. We want your feedback. We want to know if there are any issues with any of the data layers, or if there are other data layers that you need or recommend. The expectation is that we would be able to recycle through these on a more or less annual basis to refresh the data and to be able to add new layers or improve upon existing layers. So once you have the chance to look at this, we encourage your feedback. There's an email address at the bottom of the web page that you can contact us and give us your feedback. So with that, I will close and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. I mean, it is, we kind of take it for granted. We take a lot for granted, just driving here, how amazing it is. But we take for granted the data availability that we have in California. I run a climate adaptation program that's part of a national network, now international actually, due to a recent Biden announcement. And my colleagues talk a lot about not having data curation efforts like this. These have been curated, these metrics, for your application. Certainly you can use other data at a 30-meter resolution. So for me, a tall guy, that's walking 33 steps. I do want to, if I can, get a slide put back up on the screen where folks can get the QR code again to these regional resource kits. And I think that there's another slide. If that's not coming up because it's cut off by the slide, we have another one. I want to thank you, Peter, for that overview. As Peter shared, this is fresh off the presses, and iterations will be made down the line and improvements. But I want to pause and go to the executive committee, you, Secretary Crowfoot, to see if you'd like to ask any questions or close us out.
I would just emphasize the point that we want these regional toolboxes to be useful. And so Peter invited input, and good on you guys for finishing the Central Coast Resource Kit in time for this meeting. As Patrick says, these meetings are great forcing functions. And it's so impressive that you all have put this together in a way that I can't remember what the phrase was, but management relevant. The idea that this isn't meant to be academic research that finds its way into an academic journal. It's meant to inform the work that's happening. And sneak peek, we don't want to make decisions on projects from Sacramento or Washington, D.C. We want those to be regionally identified to address that mix of priorities that gets called pillars. And so we need this resource kit to be used for planning, for project selection. And then our goal, which we've talked about in the past, is to really create an ongoing pipeline of state and federal funding that flow into regions based on key community priorities. Key priorities for communities, for tribal partnerships, for ecological function. That's really what we want. But we want this engagement. We need this engagement with the resource kits in order to be able to do that. After lunch, we're going to shift to a discussion with practitioners, folks that are trying to get projects done on the ground. And so we can ask them, do you have the information that you need? And we're going to ask and talk about how we can help get projects done more quickly and effectively. Just turning to our colleagues, let me turn to you, Sam.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I was just incredibly impressed around the base data and the work that all of you have been doing. I've been taking notes. We have, again, this regional collaboration within my office, as I mentioned earlier. This is data that we could actually lift up. We have a state clearinghouse as part of the state's integrated climate adaptation resiliency program that my office manages, and I have staff here that will be in touch with you to actually incorporate that. And data around sort of the tribal assessment. I think it was Peter who talked about that. I really want to sort of follow up with you and stuff. We'll follow up on our, what I mentioned earlier, fifth climate assessment is underway now, and the tribal component is a critical part of that. So we'll have that also sort of engagement. And this has been incredibly helpful for me to connect the dots in terms of what the state is doing, and amazing work that is being done in this space. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's terrific. I don't want to be the guy. I'm one of those guys that get the hangries, right? So I don't want to be the one that's keeping the crowd from lunch. But I do want to go to both of you again if you have anything else to say. Otherwise, I thank our panelists and thank the great questions from the executive committee. Definitely scan the QR code on your tables to access those resources. And again, these are being developed for you to be applied by you for your questions. So if things come up that you don't fit your interest, please let that team know. I know Station Director Barheit, the Pacific Southwest Research Station, is very invested in getting these resources out and other tools that are being developed by the task force, and is going to be taking a leadership role in that in the coming future. So we're really excited about that as well. That's fantastic. But with that,
and I might just close by saying, Steve and John, huge thanks for really connecting science to management decisions. And to Virginia, Chris, and Peter, sometimes in government, in my past anyways, I've been frustrated that there's a lot of good scientific work happening, but it doesn't seem to be relevant to the decisions that we have to make. And your presentations are a great example of how you all as leaders are helping inform these decisions. And so I think let's keep it up. Let's make sure we're continuing to ask ourselves what kind of scientific questions we need to answer and how we answer those in a way that can actually impact decisions on the ground. We're going to transition into lunch now.
Can I make just one last point on this? We've given you demos in previous meetings, so we didn't do it today, but we are developing a tool called Planscape that CNRA is leading that takes all this information and puts it in a decision support framework. So you, if you're a regional collaborative, can use all these metrics and tools and decision support systems to plan and prioritize projects to go faster. And we're determined to make sure it's consistent with the NEPA and CEQA work the agencies are doing. So it's not extra work, it's accelerating the work. I know the Forest Service in particular is starting to talk to their forest about using this on the ground. So it's not, as Wade said, a bunch of academic-based indicators of forest health. It's actual information that you need to meet your permit requirements, your CEQA requirements, your NEPA requirements. That's what we really need feedback on. This isn't going to work if it's an extra layer that's going to add more time to your planning and decision making. It's supposed to streamline it. So please, as we've said, give us feedback on how we can tweak these tools to help you accelerate your work. And with that, yes, we're headed to lunch.
And the only request I'd have for lunch is if you came with people that split up. Sam raised the benefit of connecting dots, and this is all about connecting dots among you all and all of us doing this work. So get out of your comfort zone, meet some new friends at lunch. We're going to come back into this room, or if you're online, we're going to get back online.